I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a reenactor, and for 36 years I used my hobby of living history in the classroom to bring the subject to life for my students. I'm not in the classroom anymore. Instead, I'm driving to all sorts of insane places, trying to document the past and tell the stories of early California. So I told the tales of the California missions and the Assistencies and the Presidios and the settlement period. Then I stumbled across references to outlaws and bandits frequenting saloons that were inside secularized missions, and that really intrigued me, especially when I started running across names like Jesse James and the Dalton brothers and Tiburcio Vasquez. So since then, I've also been tracking these outlaws, and I call this chasing Bandidos. So what I'm doing today is I'm heading out to the San Fernando Valley, and we're going to look at why two different communities out there, Sunland and Sun Valley, changed their names because of some outlaws. I hope you stick with me. Our next two outlaws are Kid Thompson and Alvarado or Alva Johnson. And the Johnson family ended up homesteading in an area that used to be called Monte Vista. Later is going to be called Sunland. And that's kind of where the story starts. But then the action's really going to shift over to a place that used to be called Roscoe, but is now called Sun Valley. And it'll make sense in a little bit. In the early 1880s, farmer A. Johnson and two of his sons, John and Cornelius, homesteaded land in the tiny, rugged, and remote community of Monte Vista. That's later going to be called Sunland. A stream trickled down Big Tujunga Canyon to the Johnson land. A few miles downstream, Johnson's third son, Alvarado, nicknamed Alva, owned a ranch and farmland he had gotten by marrying the widow of the man who had originally homesteaded it. So for more than a decade, the Johnsons endured what nature in California threw at them. And if you live in Southern California, you know this part. Fire, flood, mudslides, landslides. Except we're going to also throw in some grizzlies too. And okay, they managed to keep things going. But remember, the Johnsons have two different homesteads going on. And now there's going to be a dispute about water. And what's going to happen is the elder Johnson, the head of the clan, he and his two elder sons, they decide to start damming up the Tujunga, and they're forming a water company. There's a bit of a problem. The water's not getting down to Alva's farm, and he ends up going to a lawyer, and that's dragging out forever, and he's running out of money. So things are getting desperate. After years of the Southern Pacific Railroad's jacking up its price for shipping produce at harvest time, Alva was driven out of farming. Although he stayed on the ranch, he managed a grain store in downtown Los Angeles. Alva hired two ranch hands, William H. Kid Thompson and George Smith, both of whom had criminal records, to work his land. That's Thompson. Within a few months, Unsolved train robberies began plaguing the Southern Pacific. At 10:30 on the evening of Saturday, December 23rd, 1893, Southern Pacific train number 20, known as the Overland Express, left the Arcade Depot in Los Angeles, bound for San Francisco. In the cab were engineer Rocky Bill Stewart and his firemen. They reached Burbank on time at 11 o'clock. After Burbank, most of the first-class passengers went to bed in the Pullman sleeper cars, while the others settled into their seats for the long night ahead. At 11:30, the train approached the small town of Roscoe, 4 miles north of Burbank, at what is now San Fernando Road and Sunland Boulevard in Sun Valley. Okay, so the town of Roscoe. Okay, let's see if you define it as a town. It's got a railroad depot, which really meant a bench, so you could wait for the train to come by, because it wasn't really a normal stop, and you could signal and the train will stop. There was a water tank, which was needed for the train. There was a grocery store. Okay. There's also a siding. So you flip the switch, freight trains could go on to what was called the blind siding. Okay, and this would allow the passenger trains to go by, and this would end in some railroad ties and sand berms. Okay, so here's what's happening. Train's coming into Roscoe, and there's a loud bang, and the crew's looking at each other going, what's going on? And they turn and they see a couple of guys climbing over towards the engine, and they're armed with revolvers and they're armed with a Winchester rifle. Evidently they fired a few times to kind of get people's attention, but the noise of the engine didn't really allow them to hear anything. And they were told to pull over, which they did, and they went up the siding. And then once the robbery took place, the engineer was told, drive this off the rails. Go to the end and just drive this off the rails. And the crew begged the outlaws to not wreck the train. So what ended up happening is the crew was then walked away to a campfire about a quarter of a mile away, left there and told, don't follow us. And the outlaws disappeared into the brush. And after a decent amount of time, the crew went back to the train, and then they alerted the authorities when they got to a place they could. The Southern Pacific and Wells Fargo companies sent telegrams to all the neighboring sheriffs and police departments with descriptions of the robbers and offering a reward for $1,000 for information leading to their arrest. The robbers' trail was followed for several miles by the company's posses, but then doubled back because the trail was lost. Then it happened again. 7 weeks later, money spent, the trio pulled off another heist at the same spot, but with more serious consequences. It was the same train, the northbound Overland Express number 20. On the evening of the 15th of February, the train was 40 minutes late, leaving Los Angeles due to a large crowd of passengers. Engineer David W. Thomas put on extra speed to make up the time. With him was his regular fireman, 27-year-old Englishman Arthur Masters. Also in the cab was fireman Ben LaGrange, who was dead heading back to his home in San Fernando. Okay, it's well after midnight, and the engineer is trying to make up for lost time desperately. So he is just gunning it. He's opened up the throttle, and he's trying to make up for that lost time. And I'm sure, like, as he was approaching Roscoe, he was thinking about the robbery that took place, 7 weeks earlier. That had to have been on his mind. Well, he does what he's supposed to do. He's approaching Roscoe and he blows a whistle. And what ends up happening is he sees a couple of guys sitting on a bench. And it's like, oh man, I don't want to slow down because he's got great momentum going. He's making up the time. And he's about to start going uphill. And, well, he sees the two guys get up and one of them has something that looks like a ball on a rope, and he sets it on fire to signal for the train to stop. And it's like, that's not normal. Okay, this is probably a robbery. So he decides he's going to ignore the signal, and he continues just with the throttle wide open. Unfortunately, the outlaws have already anticipated this, and they had already thrown the switch. So the train goes off under the blind siding, and it derails along with a couple of the freight cars that were filled with oranges. Engineer Thomas crawled to safety behind a cactus. Fireman Arthur Masters wasn't so lucky. He lay pinned against the blazing hot boiler, his legs crushed. Train stowaway Harry Daly was hurled into the left cylinder. The 19-year-old died from the impact. Masters' screams of agony could be heard over the robbers' bullets and over the explosion that blew open the safe, containing a few $1,000 in cash and nearly 100 pounds of gold and silver coins. When the gunfire stopped, the robbers headed out under the cover of darkness with a wagon full of loot disguised as a milk wagon. Thomas and other survivors rushed to rescue Masters. He begged them to put a bullet in his head or to give him a gun so he could do it himself. Instead, they worked feverishly to free his trapped body. He died an hour later after they pulled him free. U.S. Marshal George Guard and Railroad Detective Will Whispering Smith were recalled from the San Joaquin Valley, where they were just days away from capturing Christopher Evans, one of two notorious train robbers who had nothing to do with the Roscoe robberies. So, U.S. Marshal Guard and Railroad Detective Will Whispering Smith, they're shuttling back and forth between the LA area and the San Joaquin Valley because they're looking for train robbers. Remember, they're also chasing Christopher Evans and John Sontag, so who have nothing to do with this particular case. But these guys are going to be a lot more famous. So now the evidence is starting to mount. Someone is swearing up and down that he saw Kid Thompson on the train earlier. And there's another witness who says that George Smith, his partner, was in Alameda and paid a prostitute with gold coins that were taken from the robbery. So evidence is starting to mount, and then people really start looking at the tracks. And there's a wagon that's left tracks from Roscoe, and they go up to Monte Vista, which is later going to be called Sunland. Remember, Alva Johnson's got his farm up there. And, okay, here's what a $1,000 reward does to brotherly love. Johnson's two brothers say, we saw them, we saw people that match the description of the outlaws, and yep, that's our brother and the two guys working for him. Kid Thompson hightails it to Arizona. And George Smith, he's got a different strategy. He's just laying low in town. Now, Alva Johnson gets arrested, but then charges are dropped because there isn't really enough evidence. And now people in the town are really, really angry at the other Johnson brothers for turning on one of their own. 8 months after the deadly robbery, lawmen got a break in the case. A man who had helped Thompson launder some of the robbery money turned him in to Arizona authorities. In the meantime, local lawmen caught up with Smith and persuaded him to testify against Alva. Alva, 36, confessed to the robbery at the urging of his wife and children. He told authorities where he had buried the booty in his Sunland orchard and agreed to testify against Thompson, accusing him of throwing the spur switch. Thompson would accuse Johnson of doing the same thing, an argument that would save Thompson's neck. In May of 1895, Thompson was found guilty and sentenced to hang, but his lawyer managed to have the conviction overturned on appeal. He argued that Thompson had been convicted of throwing the spur switch, yet no one had been able to prove he did so. Therefore, he could only be punished for robbery and not for murder. He was retried in 1897 and convicted and sentenced to life in Folsom State Prison. Alva was also spared hanging, sobbing uncontrollably until the judge announced a life sentence at the state prison at San Quentin because he had saved the county the expense of a trial. While he was imprisoned at San Quentin, Alva's wife divorced him. Okay, Johnson's not going to be sitting quietly in prison. In 1900, Johnson and another inmate, B.F. Healy, they make it over the wall of San Quentin. And they are running for their lives, quite literally. And Healy gets shot, and the shots end up attracting the attention of other guards. And pretty soon, it's Alva Johnson running for his life with 80 guards chasing him. And they eventually corner him, and he surrenders, like, okay, you got me. And they bring him back to serve out the rest of his sentence. In July 1902, Kid Thompson was one of 6 convicts at Folsom involved in another prison break. The guards overpowered them, and the 6 were placed in solitary confinement. The Kid took part in 4 more unsuccessful attempts to break out in July of 1903, June 1904, December 1904, December 1905. In 1907, after serving 11 years, Alva Johnson was released from prison. And what's interesting is the same people that were objecting to the Johnson brothers turning in Alva, because they turned on one of their own, were objecting. There was a big outcry of, hey, what are you doing releasing this murderer? And he ends up moving to Washington. He remarries. And what ends up happening is he ends up reconciling with his brothers. And he will pass on around 1920 at the age of 63. So end of his story. In 1909, Kid Thompson was also paroled. The parole board called him a model prisoner, which is pretty odd considering he was a convicted murderer who had attempted to break prison 5 times. Within months, he had broken his parole and he went to Canada, then to Chile. And in 1915, he left Chile on a Russian ship that was bound for Europe. But World War I had just started, and his ship was captured and sunk in the South Pacific by a German raider. Thompson was picked up with the survivors, and he was taken to a German prisoner of war camp. When released, he was shipped to San Francisco, put ashore, where he was recognized by a sheriff's deputy who arrested him for failing to report to his parole officer. He said he couldn't report because he was in a German prison camp. He was sent back to prison, but must have been paroled again because in 1920 he was telling his war experiences to his probation officer. The last record of the notorious Kid Thompson was in 1921. His parole officers found him wandering homeless, confused, and ill. He was then 50 years old, and his mind and health were wrecked. The officers sent him to the hospital at San Quentin, where he was treated for 3 months and then released. In 1948, more than 3 decades after Roscoe was annexed to Los Angeles and more than half a century after the train robbery, Roscoe was reduced to a mere street name, which is the primary dividing line between northern and southern San Fernando Valley. Although memories had dimmed, conflicting stories emerged as to whether Roscoe was the name of the robber, the train's engineer, or the brakeman. Never mind that Roscoe was probably a land developer. Townsfolk didn't want the community to be named for a notorious 19th century train robbery. And a chagrined Roscoe Chamber of Commerce polled the residents in 1948, and the name of the community was changed to Sun Valley. Okay, so that's the end of the story of Kid Thompson and Alva Johnson, two local Southern California boys who went bad. So I'm gonna go on to my next adventure and look for other bandidos to chase. I hope you stick with me on my journey.